I have the fun part now of turning this over to our lead team member here, Claire Blyes of WXY Architecture.
Welcome, everyone, post-lunch. I'm Claire Wise, the W in WXY, leading a collaborative team, and I hope that this presentation really sets up a great question and answer period. We are from New York, WXY. Kara, who's our project manager, is here with me, and we'd like everyone on this to introduce themselves. Tiff.
What up, though? My name is Tiff Massey. I am a Detroit interdisciplinary artist, and I am happy to be here and competing in this competition.
Chris Leong, partner at Leong Architecture practice based in New York.
Dominic Leong, a partner with Chris in Leong Architecture practice, and really interested in design and how it can engage the public realm.
I'm Karen Michelle. I'm an urban planner with WXY Studio in New York.
Mitch McEwen, Ann Office, which is an architecture and urban design practice between New York and Detroit.
Hi, I'm Diane Jones-Allen. I'm principal landscape architect with Design Jones LLC out of New Orleans.
Austin Allen from Design Jones as well, New Orleans.
And Craig Schwitter from Bureau Happold Engineering.
We want to describe an approach that in discussions and in putting this together, we felt really coalesced around movement. Many of you recognize the Diego Rivera mural program, and the holdings in this museum represent a kind of movement. Another kind of movement is when individuals get together to make change and are willing to admit it, like in the Scarab Club. Where another kind of movement comes when you have places where hundreds of and tens of thousands can gather because it's a place they want to be. Other kinds of movements really use cities. They use cities to make statements, and statements, in this case, in the 60s, about civil rights. Then there's the kind of places we all design that are also about movement. Here we are in the reconstruction of the Rockaway Boardwalk that we designed that tries to accommodate movement that when they originally designed the boardwalk, they didn't think about. They didn't think New Yorkers were ever going to surf. Also, bringing pleasure and water and moving people to a place that formerly was seen as fenced off, taking those fences down and inviting people in here in the Battery Park. Also, a movement about ecology and environment here at Sea Glass in the Battery, where we want to take people underwater, especially if they could never learn how to scuba dive like me. And Idea City, again, an event that happened in Detroit that brought people together, including Tiff, Kara, and even myself around the table to talk about ideas. More movement, the electricity, okay? An amazing thing where bikes are actually describing and drawing space. Jazz Fest, where actually vehicles do different things with plazas. Again, these events aren't always about just what they are. They're also about what cities need to be. Parades, many of which have to be designed and carefully crafted, use the city as platforms and plazas. Here in Leong's work in Venice, there's a new way of looking at how flexible these kinds of spaces and tables can be. Back to, again, spaces of eating and occupying space where you don't, with bringing back the environment, bringing back plants with Pete Adolph and us at the Battery, but also hanging out. Another, a way of looking at space new kinds of innovations in terms of 4D and Mitch McEwen's work. Performance in public space, here again in Far Rockaway Park. Back to Detroit, the North End Farm, really looking at the design of edible space. Movement around advocating and organizing for these spaces. Again, water scarcity, water quality, water voices. The techno movement and what each of that kind of flow can create for a city. Diane Jones' work here under an elevated structure, bringing water. Storefront with Leung, reflection in an exhibition space. Through history, uncovering a slip and bringing back the water in Greenpoint. Chinatown, different ways to kind of occupy space with other people, Leung. Back to Detroit, writing does matter. If we start looking at movement through contributions of writing, next, through Tiff and what she makes, through people working in spaces, on commercial products, here at DIA, chess and that engagement, form with Tiff, form that actually impacts what you can make and how you can touch it and what you can do with it, bringing music to places and to a house that needed to be reimagined with Mitch McEwen. Astor Place, I always say that sometimes form can be a tree guard. And ending on really the what is known as techno, obviously, that here we are, a kind of space movement, and I'm handing it off to Tiff.
Culture. So, in the city of Detroit, culture is what kept us alive. And not only Detroiters alive, its influence has traveled outside of Detroit's borders. And so you really heavily see the influence of techno in Berlin and the economy that is associated with Detroit sound. And it only makes sense that Detroit experiences the same impact and importance that its culture generates to other places internationally.
So this project, for me, it's a kind of dream project to even be here presenting to you and with this team. Both because Detroit is a city that has inspired me so much and changed me, and a place that I want to be a part of how it changes and how it sees itself. But also because Woodward Avenue, it's hard to think of a street, even throughout the United States, that's more important than Woodward Avenue. And so when we're talking about movement, it's the movement of people, but it's also how places change history, right, and change what's possible. And this collection of institutions around here, the DIA itself is this amazing collection of art, right? But this street and this area has so many different touch points that part of what this team has been just kind of vibing about is how the festivals and the things that happen here on the street in a very temporary way can inspire something that takes place in the site itself, right? How relationships between these institutions can inspire something that takes place in the site itself, and something that's so dynamic that it physically changes concrete, right? That it physically changes the street. So that's how we've been talking about the relationship between landscape and culture, between ecology and the street in terms of facade, in terms of ground.
So we wanted to step back a little bit, and part of what we've been doing and sort of preparing is really looking at the Midtown Cultural District and the space around the DIA compared to other cultural districts around the United States. So we looked at 6 different districts, including Detroit. The next one. And so on the upper left, Brooklyn Arts District, Chicago's Millennium Park, Lincoln Center, Manhattan, Grand Avenue Corridor in Los Angeles, Yerba Buena Arts Center in San Francisco, and the DIA. And I think what's really unique about comparing these is, of all of these, the area on the DIA is the largest at 84 acres. And you know, from above, they all kind of look similar, but I think they're actually very organized very differently. And looking at each one of them, and looking at the spaces between them, with Brooklyn Arts District, it's really organized around the city block, and the public space is really the series of streets. With Millennium Park, it's really a promenade at the edge of the city, with a lot of landscape where the institutions really float like islands within that space. At Lincoln Center, it's historically more of a plinth that's sort of separated from the street, but recent renovations have tried to engage it more directly with the street by sort of carving it away. The Grand Avenue Corridor in Los Angeles is really a linear organization where the institutions line up along that strip. And Yerba Buena is really anchored by cultural institutions that create two main public spaces. And what's unique about the Midtown Cultural District and the space around the DIA is its openness. It has the highest percentage of openness among all these different districts. It's almost twice that to Lincoln Center, and it's almost this, a little bit more, but very similar to Millennium Park. So this openness is really one of its really significant aspects.
Yeah, and to build on that, we also understand this kind of permeability or distribution of openness, in a way, a unique characteristic of Detroit as a whole, and we think this is something to kind of continue to explore. So one of the other things we did when we looked at these different cultural districts was try to evaluate the cultural assets that exist relative to the different institutions that create these cultural clusters. So we were really trying to actually move out of this conversation of district and think of cultural cluster and think of this project as a cultural cluster. And what is a pretty apparent, just in a really direct way, is that this project has a diversity of different cultural organizations. So if you go to the next slide, we started to compare that relative diversity. So for example, if you look at Brooklyn Cultural District, there's really two types of cultural organizations, which is education and performance space, versus the DIA, which has 6 types of cultural organizations and 12 distinct cultural institutions. One thing we did realize, though, was that within this diversity, click to the next one, there is this sort of diverse network, and so there's a proximity or a clustering of these institutions, but the issue is that all of these separate missions go to the next slide, education, African American history, the Scarab Club, which is this amazing social history or social kind of legacy, science, education, library, even civic kind of institutions, and having art at the center of this is really significant, and sort of understanding all of these as culture. But the issue is really that there's a little bit of a disconnection or a siloing between these institutions. So we see this project really about looking at the grounds as a way to create those connections. Next. And the point was that there is maybe a way to bring in more spaces for performance. So we realized, compared to the other cultural districts, this district could benefit from more kind of spaces that supported the events that were already happening, the movements that are already happening, like de-electricity, or the other kind of really public engaged events. So how do we start to look at the kind of grounds and what's already happening? So we were looking at specifically what areas are used already, and really starting to kind of do almost a kind of forensic understanding of that. Next. And just really thinking that this moving away from these kind of static parts to kind of more animated ground, where the spaces around these institutions, really trying to understand the physicality of them, the language and the shape. And this kind of process is really trying to develop a unique landscape language that is unique to the district in Detroit, and trying to really start to connect these through this kind of animated ground, so you have opportunities for the different institutions to create dialogues and more accessibility and even kind of curatorial intersections. And ultimately, the idea is that this would generate beyond the kind of limits of this specific cultural cluster and into the city, and even the region, nationally and internationally. So we're really interested in this idea of how to animate the grounds and really understanding that this combination of diversity of institutions and this plenitude of open space is really an opportunity to create a very unique language for this landscape.
So water is a really critical asset that Detroit has because the city sits on the Great Lakes. And probably without the Detroit River, the River Rouge, the connection to Lake Erie, there may have not have been a Detroit because water was important to the industry. Just as the African American community within Detroit, we feel water also needs to be revealed, exposed, celebrated. Water is part of environment and culture. Currently, with issues of climate adaptation and pollution, these issues allow us an opportunity to use approaches not only to address these issues, but to celebrate and reveal the infrastructure and to deal with the connection that Detroit has to its water. There are many opportunities here for that. There are opportunities like, for instance, having misters that comfort, using bioretention and a decentralized system between all of the facilities to capture water and to clean water and to expose it, and most importantly, to allow the opportunity for people to interact with it. Water no longer should be an object in fountains or far away. It should, the way it works, its importance should be central to the open spaces that were just discussed and should be a way to celebrate the people and the place. I wanted to talk about the direction. Those arrows direct to the Detroit River, and it's about, letting people know that it's there and using those spaces to make that connection. Next slide. Okay, so right now there's 37 or 33% permeable space and 67% paved space. And those paved spaces are the opportunity. Those paved spaces allow all different kinds of facilities and capture to happen, and those places where interaction can happen. So those paved spaces allow the opportunity to use water.
Yeah, this is, something that, as a Detroit changed me. Thinking about landscape as something that's urban is something that, even though I had done urban design in New York before I got here, it really, this city taught me to think that differently. And in thinking that differently, that's not just a design aspect or a spatial thing, that's already social and political. And in that way, I think Detroit, through amazing figures like Grace Lee Boggs, as well as amazing institutions like Allied Media Projects, Detroit is a leader in thinking ecology and social politics together. And so when we're talking about this project, we're also talking about that. And WXY, especially with their leadership in urban design engagement in very large projects, is really outlining a framework for how we can bring our design expertise into conversations with people who already live here and think here and innovate here and do collective work here and are already on these sites, but also the kind of broader city, right? Because this is a place where Detroit can become legible to itself. And that already happens on Woodward Avenue, but it doesn't necessarily happen in a really embodied way. So that's how we're starting to kind of formulate both the process and the potentials here. And of course, that speaks, as I mentioned, to the kind of history of Woodward Avenue, beyond just the automobile. I think when we're talking about the landscape of the site as it is now, the automobile is something that moves through the site, but it leaves so many traces on the site, right? There's so much parking, there's so much asphalt, so much street, but there's also this other activity that moves through the site that just doesn't yet have the opportunity to leave the same physical traces there right now. The automobile is more dominant on, right? But there are these other more imaginative scapes here. And that's right. And one thing that's very important is to acknowledge that this is a majority Black city. That's something that my work, and when I said Detroit changed me, it gave me more sort of imaginative tools to do that as an architect. And I think what we're looking at is not just in a kind of pragmatic way, how do you bring the majority of the city to the site, but also in terms of the cultural imaginations, how does Detroit register to itself as a majority Black city and the amazing cultural phenomena that that has spawned, right? Not just Motown, but techno, right? Not just music, but political imagination, and also the broad sense of art and performance that we've been talking about that already register in these institutions. Oh, yeah, as far as the site, yeah, this is kind of where we hand off to Tiff, but I think, or maybe to WXY, but we've also been looking in a pragmatic way about pedestrianism, right? This is one of the neighborhoods in the city where you can walk around, right? So, but at the same time, the sense of how you move as a pedestrian doesn't necessarily have a clear relationship to the institutions as far as just basic access.
So, speaking about people and the way that people use the space, we want the Midtown Cultural Cluster to become a space, even more so than it already is, where people can gather together. People who are from Detroit and people who are not from Detroit can gather together, can think together, can relax together, can make together, can create together, and can make change together. And one of the ways to do that, we're very convinced, is through active, integrated, and engaged community engagement. Patrice Scott said, in order to understand Detroit, you have to experience Detroit, see Detroit, live Detroit, feel Detroit, because Detroit is a state of mind. And as a group of people, some of us come from Detroit, some of us don't come from Detroit, we know that in order to truly understand Detroit, we have to work with people who feel Detroit and see Detroit in very different ways. And we often do that in our normal community engagement process through a very linear process that starts with analysis, then brings in engagement through stakeholder outreach and community design workshops, takes the lessons learned from that analysis and engagement to develop collaborative design concepts, and then that finally results in a public realm plan. But considering the diversity of our team, we have architecture, exhibition design, installation art, engineering, landscape architecture, urban planning represented. And we all do community engagement in our own way. For example, we're working with the Cleveland Museum of Art to help them understand how people use the grounds and how they want to use the grounds, how the exhibitions and collections in the museum can better be reflected on the outside of the museum building, and how to overcome significant disparities between who their audience is and what the city looks like. We're working in East Harlem to help community leaders really become the people who determine what their neighborhood looks like. And in Brooklyn, we're working with the Department of Education, as well as students and parents and community leaders to help figure out how to establish equity among all public schools and ensure that schools are desegregated. Mitch is working in Pittsburgh to imagine what reparations look like. Leong are working in New York and in Venice to create spaces and objects that help break down barriers and bring people into conversations that they wouldn't otherwise be able to have. Design Jones is working in New Orleans and in the Lower Ninth Ward, coming to people, coming to their rallies, bringing themselves to people rather than forcing people to come to them to understand how people use space and how they make change. And we also work with different audiences. Diane works with audiences that include other professionals. Tiff works with other artists in Detroit. And we bring together people who come from many different walks, many different professions, whether it's architecture, design, interior design, writing, urban planning, to highlight professionals, especially underrepresented professionals, and provide forums for people to engage and exchange. And so in Detroit, we want our process to be a little bit different. We want it to build upon the success of existing Midtown festivals, and we want to begin it with community engagement, but we want to make sure that we end with community-driven design. So our team, as we go through this process, provided we move on, would include not only our Detroit Culture Moves team, it would also include the stakeholders in the Midtown Cultural Cluster, and it would include stakeholders from all around Detroit. Maybe that would include Detroit Food Labs, Sidewalk Detroit, Detroit Collaborative Design Center, of course, and Mercy School, Mosaic Youth Theater, Allied Media, and anyone else who thinks that they should be included in this process. We want it to become a cyclical process that moves between seasons, which Claire can speak to more.
So we thought it might be helpful for this discussion to actually imagine what this could look like. So we thought, what is it really about public space and an urban design approach that kind of brought people together? And we felt that you had an opportunity with the timing to actually have a seasonal approach to this project. So we imagined that in one of the ways to analyze, to participate, to engage with people is to say, if we either added onto an event or designed something to go with it, or we're planning a meeting, that it's happening in the winter. What does that mean? It's happening in the fall. What does that mean? Maybe some of our engagement, it's really important, it's outside, but it needs support. So we really saw that in addition to the normative ways that architects and landscape architects model things, there could be a certain amount of one-to-one design and piloting of kind of public space design while doing this that would add to our understanding and hopefully heighten the kinds of discussions and ideas that people would bring to the table. So you look at a place, and one of the things a kind of an approach like this could start to do is, instead of, as both Chris and Dominic said, looked at each institution and what it brought to the table, you could, with the next slide, really start looking at these mats and reaching out. So you start with our work of wondering what it would be the best in terms of a cluster. Which of these groups could we cluster together around a topic, around a time, and actually look at a terrains within this cluster in order to create new kinds of discussions to happen. So the library, the DIA, the Science Museum, the DIA, the Charles H. Wright Museum, and the school. So in a sense, none of what we're showing in these diagrams are answers. They're really about, if we put that out there on how to organize the community engagement as more of a design problem, we all call this basically you're designing while you're engaging. It really relates to the huge amount of engagement that we believe has already been done, but also we get to bring and test some strategies in terms of public space design. So if we're visualizing this, it allows a kind of reading of places there are now. Do they need to be heightened so that you could occupy them for food? In the summer, is there something about shade in these places that needs to be modeled or extended? What about water? And what about using water? What about music and the kind of either both groups and also personal sound? Equally, with the History Museum, if it occurs a discussion with them in the fall, what does it mean to have a discussion in the fall versus another time of year? And so that, for us, brought kind of the environmental discussion in with what I would call functional and programmatic. And we see a way to kind of organize this very tight 4 months that you're going to anticipate around really a kind of excitement around people, place, water, energy, and movement. But I actually think that the most exciting part of this for us is to not only hear your questions, but we thought it might be a good idea if we asked a question.
So, with all the newness and all the new development that is happening here on the grounds in Detroit, Detroiters are rarely and almost never asked, their opinion of what they would like to see the change look like. So I'm asking you, what would you like to see? Who would you like to see involved? And how would you like to see it implemented?
That was a signal that we're ready for question and answer.
Okay. Just as a kind of quick wrap up, I think we're going to have another more formal wrap up. But one of the aspects of this that I think is a game changer, from the perspective of the whole project, is I think inviting artists to really be a part of this, right? Recognizing these are art institutions. This is a place where culture happens in this city. And so to have Tiff on this team as an artist from Detroit who has global recognition, and I think what we share in common across the team is we all have a little bit of artist in us, but I think whatever we do, we're always working on situations, right? Designing situations. And so what we're starting to do is really, as a team, already start to have a lens for how we're going to formulate the way that we will locate and think about and share what those situations might be, not just amongst the team, but with the broader folks of Detroit that we look forward to engaging with.
Okay, so we are going to begin our Q&A session. Wonderfully, we have a lot of extra time here. So we're going to begin now with the jury, and we'll begin with their questions, and then after that, we will open it up to the audience.
Hi, I'm Rick Rogers. I'm president of the College for Creative Studies.
Juanita Moore, president of the Charles Detroit Museum of African American History.
I'm Julie Borgman, professor of landscape architecture at UVA and founder and principal of Dirt Studio.
Hi, I'm Maurice Cox. I'm the planning director for the city of Detroit.
Hello, Kara McCarty, director of curatorials, Cooper Hewitt, Smithsonian Design Museum.
Mario Moore, visual artist from Detroit, but live in Brooklyn.
William Gilchrist. I'm director of planning and building for the city of Oakland, California. Spent a little bit of time in New Orleans.
And I'm Jonathan Massey, dean and professor at the A. Alfred Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the Great University of Michigan.
All right, who's going to start first on the jury?
So you talked a lot about movement and public engagement and the several events that happen like during the year, like the festivals that people from Detroit are familiar with, and how those things take place and how that'll be a part of possibly the design process. But how have you been thinking about those in between times, like for moments that community can go and rest, and like what does that look like? Do you have some maybe previous examples of spaces that you guys have created or built where those type of things exist?
Well, I think I can jump off on that, but I think that Diane too could talk about it. I think what we tried to show in even some images of the Battery or Astor Place or the Rockaway Boardwalk, that those two worlds need to coexist. So what's really missing that we see today are these compelling places that people want to go to hang out and feel good, to have a sense of kind of rest, poetry, relaxation, and then they can get into these other connected movement spaces. And so we realize that's a lack. I think in our work, and the reason we felt like it's so important to have an urban design or public realm design approach, as opposed to each single discipline, is that there's a real potential here for because of the art being at the center, that the mechanism of commissions or commissioning is actually something that could be part of the dynamic if there's a really solid public realm framework that allows that to happen. Like a good example of that is in doing the urban design for Times Square, everyone realized that getting all these big trucks to come in and other things for every single event actually disrupted the space for buying something and regular people. The same thing here is that there's a possibility of putting that infrastructure in. And so we recognize that there's a kind of identity but solidity to the public realm that is right now bluntly sidewalk, street, lawn, parking lot. There needs to be the additional layers and language that allow it to be used way more. But I would say, so I'm going to do the little experience thing, is that a recent thing we finished up a year ago that's now being implemented is the Brooklyn Cultural District. And it had a really great plan. The problem is no one could agree to the streetscape design, and it had a lot to do with all of the groups around felt that the BAM Cultural District wasn't them, it was BAM. Mm-hmm. And so part of that engagement was organizing and hearing people so that we could provide a street walk and sidewalk design, which right now is getting implemented and is, I think, pretty interesting looking. But each institution was able to kind of move the design around and commission different people to do variations of the design, so when it got done, it was specific to their building, to Mark Morris, or specific to Brick, or specific to the BAM Park. So I think that's an example of, I would say most of us share, and I'm going to let Diane Jones, a kind of systems-based approach, but we expect a lot of poetry out of the system.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea is when there isn't any festival or something specific going on, the idea is to activate the in-between. Because right now, we have kind of a node system where you go to one museum and then you either get in your car and drive to the other, or you walk quickly, but the opportunity is in the in-between, and there are things that people want in open space. You know, they want comfort, they want discovery, they want a place of rest, they want some food, and the great thing is that you have all that space to create this. And so, piggybacking on what was just said, it's about activating and using the things that activate the in-between, so that the in-between no longer is in-between, yeah, it's a place and somewhere to be. You might come here and say, oh, I'm just coming, but the museum happens to be there, but the space itself becomes activated.
You guys are a big team bringing a lot of capacity and a lot of great energy in the way you are thinking about this project. Could you say a little bit about your working history with one another and how you imagine working across your different categories of expertise, but also styles and aesthetic sensibilities?
I'm going to let Kara answer that, since she's going to be the central voice, and how she does this at WXY all the time.
We've sort of been able to do a dry run over the past 2 weeks to figure out how, especially as such a large team across multiple cities, we're able to work together. Of course, Liang and WXY and Mitch, we're all located in New York City, which makes it easy for us to come together in person and work together and draw together, which was, incredibly helpful during these past few weeks leading up to this presentation and the research that we did about the site together collaboratively. But of course, we all kind of have a history together between Borough-Happold and WXY, both in New York, and now that you all are in Detroit. Diane Jones and Austin Allen. We've all come together in different capacities through the Black in Design Conference in the past. And of course, TIFF through Idea City. So one-on-one, the individuals on our team have worked together, and I think it's been really interesting to figure out how we work together collectively. WXY, I think we're pretty well positioned to be leading a team like this as urban planners and urban designers, because through a lot of our work, we're focused on systems and processes. And we're focused on how we can bring people together and bring out their value through the process. We don't want to be overbearing in any way in terms of the design, and we want this to be a process where individual voices can come out, individual design sensibilities can come out, but we can also, through our collective capacity and working together throughout this process, come up with a sort of unified way of presenting our work and of creating our work together. And I should mention that Bruce Mao, their designers, will also be part of our team looking at signage and wayfinding and environmental design. They've been, in a way, unifying the graphic sense of our work throughout this process, and they'll continue to do it in the future.
If you don't mind if I jump in, because Jonathan, I actually had the same concern. I thought there was a lot of folks on the team, and I was wondering how it would work together, and I've worked with different folks on the team, but a couple things I want to say. One, that Kara individually is one of the young leaders who founded Black in Design at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, which has become a platform that brings together young Black professionals in architecture and urban design and urban planning and landscape in a new way. And she's bringing that energy here. But as far as WXY leading this, one of the things that I found, and Tiff and I have been talking about collaborating for years, and I've been to different sites where Tiff is doing different things, is that because WXY is really between planning and urban design and architecture, for all of us to work together, there's actually a formal flexibility in what that might mean. We're not signing on to one authorship, right? We're not signing on to one form of geometry or one process of approaching design. We're actually collaborating, I think, in a flexible way.
I'm going to then pick up on the same theme. I want to note first, I was very impressed by the iterative linearity of the process you showed in terms of the engagement and ground truthing research and ground truthing, and then moving towards a collaborative process with community and design. But to the very point of the geographic dispersion of the team, it seems a lot of the value capture you're going to be getting at through that process at the front end. It is one of the more difficultly managed aspects. It's one thing when you all go and start generating concepts, but really distilling that space between the research you've done, the engagement, the anecdotal confirmation you get from community, the aspirations, all of that, and taking it through the passes. That's a challenging, it's a great method, but it's a challenging method to manage. And with many of you all in New York, and the action being right here, I'd like to get a better sense of how you literally manage that process to get the most you can out of it.
Austin wants to go for it.
One of the things that excited me about the team was actually work in Cleveland that they were doing, where there's a cluster of museums and this really disconnect that is now being reconnected in terms of African American life and experience around there. And so I think there's where we're working, and the kinds of things we're working on that really excite the space here in different ways that people can come in and out, look at those things, and then we have people representing and from here as well. But I go back, and something I was reminded of in Herb Boyd's book was how critical it was in the 60s when first opportunity through the public university for African Americans really to have an intellectual exchange that had not happened in that kind of way before. And that happened right in this area around Wayne State, and he kind of lays out the documentation to it. And then there's this drift that happens, and I think you've got this great opportunity where all these things are converging right now at this place, and so that draws you in. That is the core that draws you in, is this moment in history that couldn't have happened earlier. I've gone through these grounds when my aunt used to work at the library, and that wasn't what this is now, you know, and it's really critical.
I think the question was about process in a pragmatic way. We've got 2 offices in Detroit. My office in Detroit, I slowed it down because I was picking up in New Jersey and New York, and now I am already working on a project on the east side of Detroit. So my office is picking up again here, and I'm going to be spending about half the year here. Bureau Happold has an office in Detroit, and we have Tiff Massey in her art studio here. So the team is very much situated between Detroit and New York, with also expertise coming from other places in the country. And we do Skype and video and flying around.
I really appreciated the way you talked about all the institutions on the site, acknowledging all the different institutions, the different expertise, and also the reference to the larger Detroit area, not just right here, but really reaching out. So, and then your presentation spoke a lot about the rich programming ideas, which I got really excited about. But I'm just wondering, do you see your what you're proposing, at least the way I'm hearing it, it's more programmatic rather than landscaping or architecture. And maybe you can answer that first, and I might follow it.
One thought about that is I think it's both. It is programmatic because there is so much richness, both with the festivals, but what's happening within the institutions. I think our approach to what we've just been discussing, and this ties into the kind of idea of the organization of the district as really a cluster. We actually see that as an opportunity to create almost an organizing formal language around the idea of cluster, around the idea of creating spaces where events can happen, but also these are also spaces where, you know, the in-between that Diane Jones talked about. So I think we see what we've really been discussing is this idea and this opportunity to use this openness and the kind of organization of the district to create both formal spaces for gathering that can be programmed, but are also places that exist on their own as landscape spaces.
You know, we think there needs to be some strong moves and some kind of important spaces that come out of this. And I think that's shared across the board. I think what's also shared is that those ideas need to come from a really robust knowledge and exploration phase, which is why we were all excited about this competition. But there's no doubt that all of us really like to be inspired by really amazing places. We like to design them. And if I think about, for example, as a thought experiment, when we looked at the percentages for this, what we're calling a cluster, the cultural cluster here, and where in Chicago, you know, the Millennium Park cluster, well, that has almost the same percentage of open space, but no one walks up and says, has any idea that it's the same kind of space, right? Like here, the numbers are the same, but the place isn't. So the potential to create one of the most amazing, I call it public space, because it has to be both landscape and industrial design and graphic design and architecture. You know, there's a huge demand for shade here, I would say, and a need. But I think all of us across the board feel like there could be some very big, important moves here, and it's worthy of a really world-class design. So even though we're not all based in Detroit, we're all actively interested in the amazing things that are happening here.
And I'll just add to that to speak a little bit to why I think our presentation focused so much on engagement and program. And it connects back to some of the work that we're doing in Cleveland at the CMA right now. So often community engagement processes and discussions about programming don't feed as deeply into the design development as they can and as they should. And I think part of our design ethos is that these conversations that we're having with the community, workshops that we're having with the community, and the decisions that are made about how spaces should be used and how they should be programmed are what should inform the design. And that's why it's such a deep part of our process. That's, you know, part of what we're doing in Cleveland right now. We're collaborating together with landscape architects, working with various stakeholders, both at the museum and outside of the museum, including students, residents, people who can and don't yet use the space, but could use the space, to figure out together, as we speak to the landscape architects who we're collaborating with, about how the design can support the kind of programming that would make spaces more inviting and welcoming to people, so that that is truly the basis for, the future design that we develop.
I'd like to thank you for the analysis and some of the set of relationships that you were beginning to uncover just by the click of a switch, which relationships you favored. And I was wondering what it revealed to you, because you showed about 5 or 6 different altered relationships between institutions. What did you learn about that, and what opportunity did you uncover as a result of that?
I mean, just to recognize, that was the point that was just getting exciting. And I would say that is where we finally started to realize, and it goes back to the sketches of, Museum Mile versus something like Lincoln Center. I'll call it a Plaza imposed thing. So once you start looking at this, you start saying, okay, is that a street or is that a piazza? Like, you start seeing that the typologies of these, however, if you go to the next one, all of a sudden, if you take a narrower section, you're talking about, lanes and promenade, like how you even configure how to look at it starts to set up this idea of, instead of campus, which we recognize it's already a campus now, but we started talking about clusters specifically because we think there is a potential for a new type here, where there's a kind of creation of sort of spaces and shaping of spaces that have a slightly different form than you've seen, that will really accrue to each of the institutions being part of something. So in a way, we liked when all of these pieces were not the same shape. When you start looking for, different kinds of spaces that could lend themselves to reproportioning these relationships. So we do, back to kind of what Mitch and Kara were talking about, and Diane, it's a design problem. We're starting to realize that the whole shaping of the discussion could be the design problem, so that the making models and creating drawings is actually so much embedded in the process of the engagement that it's not you're doing it and then you bring it after. So that's really what this was trying to illustrate.
And I just wanted to say that it goes to what Claire was talking about earlier about curating, and the fact that these relationships then become your kind of curatorial spaces, because you have these institutions and, like you can pull from them in these relationships to kind of curate this, the space, because it's kind of bringing that thing that you do in the museum out.
I think also one of the things we talked about also, which was kind of, I think, really foregrounded in the brief, which is the plaza and the kind of entrance to the museum. And I think we discussed a lot about this relationship, or this kind of sequence of arrival. What are how do people arrive on the site? And parking is very much, where you land, and that kind of reorients the front door to the institution. And then that kind of, I think, evolved into this idea of how can we really reorient the city to the institution in the way you start to reinterpret potentially the spaces that are immediately surrounding. So I think there's a lot of investigation to happen there relative to the kind of existing parking lot, the 3 entrances that seem to exist now, and can we really dive into that and understand what the potential is in that sense?
I also think we're reshaping the way we think of the automobile, and that's going to have a major impact on the way all these spaces interact with each other. And I think the Great Lake and the Great Lakes as a whole is going to be magnified in the next few years as we go through what we do in terms of climate change, and the orientation is going to be towards the river a lot more.
I'd like to do a time check. We are about 55 minutes in right now, so we have a bit of time left. I think this would be an appropriate time to turn it over to the audience here to see if we have any questions. If you do, please come on up to one of the microphones on either side. If not, we're going to turn it back over to the jury. Any takers? Okay, we're going to turn it back over to the jury.
There was another aspect of your presentation that I captured. It was only mentioned briefly, but I'd be curious for you to respond to this issue about curating what is really a rather large assembly of cultural institutions, and the idea of a framework for others to do their work. So the question has come up, is there a single hand that will design all of these spaces, or is there something that is ultimately going to be designed by multiple hands, and how you would approach that?
I think that, and I'm going to try, and Mitch jump in, to talk a little bit about the difference maybe with designing a large-scale park versus designing a series of public realm landscapes around specific buildings. And I think the opportunity here is to look at streets, sidewalks, systems, structures, buildings, utilities, as part of, I would call it, a toolkit that can be customized for different situations. So there's a sense of continuity, but there's a space, you have a certain kind of piazza, we'll call it. And you have a certain idea of, sometimes lighting is absolutely subtle so that you can do certain things with art that you can't do when you have street lights on. And well, how do you set a system in place for someone to pull that off? So that you set up, in a way it's a little bit like game theory, but you set up a situation that allows a curatorial response that, I equated a little bit to, we renovated the drawing center, which didn't have very much space. And the response actually for a lot of artists was, there's nothing wrong with it now, leave it the way it was. And actually to a lot of people, they walk in, it's completely different, okay? It has 3 more galleries, like the lights work. But in a lot of ways, it looks better than it ever has. But artists can now do almost anything with lighting and sound in that space, and they could never do it before. So it has all these controls. And I think, and I would say that there has to be kind of a bench that's a stage, a shade structure that's also a lighting thing. We want to push the envelope, but we don't want anyone to walk in, and I think it's even true of Millennium Park. That was designed by a bunch of different people, actually, and it has amazing pieces of art, but you don't say to yourself, I think I'll leave now because I can't find what I'm looking for. So I would say that, in a way, it's a new model, but it has to be a little bit of both to work.
All right. Now, if I can pull on that, because I think you were reading my mind, Millennium Park is a perfect example of the approach we're talking about, having the distinctions, and yet it still works coherently. And the authorship of multiple designers that still were able to pull together. I'd like to flip the boundary conversation for a minute. When you think about this as a focus within this urban district, and to some of what Diane was talking about orienting to the river, what about the orientation to the rest of downtown or the rest of the city? Because by the time this is done, chances are other parts of Detroit will have changed also. There'll be some trajectory that they have moved along at their own pace. But what are your thoughts about how what you do might ripple or affect beyond these boundaries? If it's a design vocabulary, a material, if it's a general sense of how space might be used by changes in population, it's not static. There's no way we have a crystal ball to know exactly what Detroit's going to look like by the time you all are done. How do you all think about the changing condition of this city through the process of your work?
Push that to Mitch, but I would say that you go to Amsterdam, right? And the streetcars actually are going through permeable pavement. They're like going, you know, a lot of people are running trains through landscape as opposed to paving. So I do think that the ideas that could be piloted here in terms of permeability, in terms of environment, in terms of like how these spaces that are normally totally hard don't have to be as hard, which is sort of the sensibility of the team. We hope, and one hopes on that level will have a huge amount of influence. Mitch, go for it.
I want to, this question I think is also one about art, right? Because there's a question of how in a kind of density way, in a way where you're talking about pedestrian access versus vehicular access, we could answer the question how this will change the city, but I think also a piece of art changes the city, right? So I think it's a question for Tiff as well. Now, one thing I want to say before passing it to Tiff is one of my many kind of ongoing Detroit projects is a collection of photographs from when I first moved here. I stayed with the mother of an artist who had this amazing collection of photographs of Belle Isle from the late 80s and the early 1990s. And it's this kind of almost kind of memoir of her experience of just kind of processing her divorce on this island. And Belle Isle to me is a place where Detroiters can access themselves. And I don't know if the city yet has a place that does that so profoundly, right? And I think that this site could do that. I think that this site could be a place where Detroiters go to access themselves and also see Detroit the way that Detroit is experienced. But I think that in a way that's already, I think, what some of the artists are doing in Detroit. So that's one of the benefits of having an artist integral in the team.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I'm thinking about in my own professional practice. I am currently fundraising to build one of Detroit's largest sculptures permanently installed on the Charles H. Wright grounds. And the impetus was that I wanted to create something where, you know, Detroiters didn't necessarily have to use fiscal means to enjoy themselves. And so being that this project is already, you know, set to be installed already in this mall, I think it's only, you know, it's perfect to actually think about all the other areas surrounding, you know, the sculpture and these other institutions of what it can also bring. So to your question about outside, I have purchased a large site that's kind of on the outskirts of this city. 7 Mile, Livernois, I guess you can say 8 Mile is the dividing line. And so I'm already thinking about what this site could actually do for a community, not necessarily my own potential needs or gains. But what is development? What does that actually look like through the gaze of artistic gaze, you know? And that's not what is being demonstrated on the grounds now. What's happening is, you know, people are basically replicating things that they've seen already. And that's not Detroit. Detroit has always been an originator of culture or style and design. And it's such an opportunity to do something that is very different. And it's nice to be, you know, in this RFQ because it's actually supporting the difference. And hopefully what happens within this can trickle down to the other developers and hopefully they wake up.
I appreciate your presentation very much. I especially appreciate all that you shared with us about process. I want to actually push on that a little more. One of you, I'm sorry, I don't remember who, used the term community-driven design. And we've, you know, in our list of criteria, we have community engagement as a big part of our decision. And we all support and I think believe very deeply in community engagement and having the community involved in this decision. But when you think about that in practical terms, it starts to sound pretty daunting. I mean, you have all these different and disparate institutions in the area, and then there are other segments of the community, the larger community, that we would like to have involved in this process in some way. And we as a community don't have a really great track record of working well together. You know, there are a lot of divisions, a lot of tensions in the community. So how do you see that all playing out, and how do you eventually distill it all down to a design that is a community-driven design?
Okay, so the important thing, as it was shown on one of the slides, that we would have multiple engagements, and that's really important. Not just multiple engagements, but varied engagements, because of the fact that you have varied institutions. You have different community groups, you have different communities. So the idea is to have varied and multiple engagements. And the key factor into how do you get that into design is that the engagement has to be transactive, meaning there has to be an exchange of knowledge, right? It's not about usually what happens. Engagement tends to be one way. We come with some maps, you know, but if you're having a transactive engagement, there's a give and a take. And you also have to be open, as Kara mentioned before, that truly this engagement, even though, okay, this process is like circular and multiple things are happening, you have to be sure that what happens, you know, what's distilled does get folded back into design or design development, as she mentioned. So it's about having varied scales of engagement, small groups, large groups, something might be happening outside, having a secular kind of engagement, and making sure there's an exchange of knowledge. Or if not, you're right. People are not, and the thing about, you know, you want people to come, and they might not see the exact form that they made, but knowing that, oh, you know, they listened to me. I had some, impact. That kind of makes stewards out of people, because that's really that to me, that's the most important part of having effective engagement. You know it's effective if people claim it. Yeah. You know, if they claim it and then they want to take care of it, you know, then they're going to take care of it. You know, they're going to do half the maintenance for you. You know, that's the key to knowing whether or not you had good engagement.
Yeah, I wanted to say from my experiences, we as engineers, we work on a lot of fantastic, very lucky cultural projects. But what it seemed to me in my career is that these are becoming much more open, transparent. It's not about the institution as much as what connects the institution. We're very lucky to work on the High Line in New York, and originally it was conceived of as somewhere to get from one museum to another. Well, it's actually just become an institution. And I think it's because it's about infrastructure, and infrastructure is everyone. There's no group that owns this piece of air or that piece of energy or that piece of road. And if you can do that, you can really create something special. And I'll also say one other thing about Detroit. I've been spending a number of years here now, and on projects, and it is an amazing city that can create really new things. And I think there's a real opportunity here.
We do have one question from the audience. If you would like to come on up to the microphone.
My name is Duncan Campbell. I'm president of the Scarab Club. Lovely presentation. The one question I have is looking at this campus, which you have identified as being a very large cultural campus, and it's a lovely study. And considering that we're in the Motor City, and considering we have a surface parking lot in the middle of this cultural district, and you talked about permeability and difference, how do you and also considering that our cultural institutions are frequented from a very wide geographic area, drawn to the cultural district, et cetera. Do you have any knowledge of the crossover between different institutions, i.e. I come down and I go to the Charles Wright, and I go to the Scarab, or I go to the DIA and the historical, et cetera? And then the big question for the Motor City is, how do you handle the car? Because it's a different density situation than you have in New York and in many other areas. Thank you very much.
Well, to kind of just jump into that, I think those studies and that sort of paradigm is, number one, important to take on as part of this project. But in a lot of ways, the opportunity of having architects and designers tackle some of those questions, which normally you'd say, okay, we're going to assign parking spaces, we'll sort of deal with it with an app, is that you have to see that this is basically, there's like lemonade to be made here. You know, as soon as Kara figured out that woodwarding was a verb, I thought, okay, this is getting interesting. So in a lot of ways, I think you have to look at movement, surfaces, connectivity as an opportunity to design places that people want to go. Now, it also may be a space that people would love to drive around. You know, driving in a way can be pleasurable also and can be more coherent. So I think you have to look at how these modes, like one of the reasons we showed in one of the festivals, people using vehicles as something, is there's an opportunity here to actually look at this cluster as having ambitions, being very ambitious, but looking at ambitions for all modes of transit, you know, including bicycle. But right now there isn't actually a narrative that joins any of the institutions. And so a huge part of, and this relates, I think, to the question about how do you get that many people together when everyone has, like, for every one person, there's at least two problems? I think you have to start using design to start weaving stories of the space that where people contribute ideas as opposed to only contribute things they want to complain about.
So we are entering into the home stretch here with our final 10 minutes. I'm going to pass it over to Claire and the team here for final remarks.
We are going to do some closing statements, and Craig, you're kicking off.
Well, just to say, it's the engineering here, as the engineer on the team and as an engineer, it's not the hard part. The really amazing thing is creating, and this group is unbelievable. So I look forward to working with you all and pushing forward.
I feel the same in terms of the team. It's very strong, I think, around these ideas of how we collaborate and come together in this space and time. I remember when I first really got to understand what was happening with Detroit Techno was a film in 1994 called Last Angel of History. And out of that, there was a word that they used, and it was the entelechy of thing or space or something. And that's what's going on, I think, right now, is we're getting ready to see a whole new set of people tell us what that space is, you know, and I'm excited and watching what can happen.
I already spoke a lot, but I think when you have, you know, when you have the landscape architect talking about techno, I think that's the team that I want to be on.
Okay. I don't know. I kind of wanted to go back to your question that you asked about, you know, we only got one Detroiter on the team. How we going to get the work done? So Detroiters who actually are living off of their artistic practice in many genres, we're not living off of Detroit recognition. So for me personally, I have an international base, and that's where I'm getting a lot of my support. So I don't think that we'll have a problem with all of these amazing, you know, professionals here, you know, showing what Detroit, what we're capable of.
So we're going to leave you with a little outtake video, of which Austin, didn't your son, you did the music for it.
over the years, it's been a place for recreation, for families to go on their family reunions, and really enjoy nature.